Prog.
Okay, we'll get started with the introductions. It's 10 o'clock. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Healing Community Study Learning Collaborative. My name is Lisa Romley, and I'm the Education Program Coordinator for the HEAL Study. We're here today to discuss and learn effective strategies for writing grant proposals. And today's panelists have extensive expertise in this area. We're very excited to have this talented group of speakers with us here today. They are all from the University of Kentucky Proposal Development Office. Kathy Gretsch is the Executive Director. In her 20-year career, she has worked closely with investigators in the leadership role to develop competitive grant applications. She currently holds a role on an NIH award providing training in grantsmanship nationally and has been invited speaker on grant topics at numerous NIH principal investigator meetings and universities. Ms. Gretsch earned a master's degree in humanities from Vanderbilt University. Eric Davidschoffer is a senior proposal development officer, and in that role, he supports development of proposals across various sponsors and mechanisms, with particular emphasis on large multidisciplinary grant applications. In this role, with an NIH award, he provides proposal development support to faculty at other universities. Mr. Davidschoffer completed his master's degree in political science from the University of Oklahoma, where he also taught courses in American federal government. Lou Hurst is a proposal development officer. She supports investigators in developing competitive grant proposals with the emphasis on Department of Defense opportunities, internal pilot programs, and diversity-related initiatives. Her background includes writing instruction, research administration, and grant writing and communications for a community-based social services agency. Ms. Hurst holds a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Kentucky and a master's degree in English from Rutgers University. So before our panelists get started, I want to remind everyone that this session is being recorded, and we are offering CE credits for today's session. One CE credit has been approved for physicians, pharmacists, nurses, social worker, and licensed drug and alcohol counselors. And I will give you instructions at the end of the session on how to obtain credit for this session. We ask that you stay muted throughout the session to reduce any echoes or extraneous noises. And if you do have questions, and we do welcome your questions, please use the raise hand feature. You can find that on the bottom of your screen if you click reactions and then click the raise hand, or you can type your questions in the chat box and I will read them during the session. We're going to have two Q&A sessions, one right before the break, and then the second one right at the end of the session. So I am going to stop sharing my screen here and turn it over to Lou.
Hello, thank you very much. So yes, I'm Lou. I'll be leading the first segment of our workshop today. And I'll start, we have no relevant financial relationships to disclose. Here's a slide on the practice gaps and needs that this workshop should address. So briefly, we understand community agencies working in substance use recovery can use grantsmanship skills to secure funding to operate their programs. And here are our learning objectives for today. I'll be presenting the first half here on finding and evaluating funding opportunities, with a special focus on substance use and recovery and with an emphasis on resources for community organizations. And Eric and Kathy will present the second half on grant writing strategies. These are expected outcomes, mainly that you'll develop skills for writing competitive grant applications, and you'll know how to identify and locate the major funding opportunities. So for part one, finding funding opportunities, I'd like to get started with a discussion of what we'll actually mean when we talk about funding. So there are actually different types of funding mechanisms, and the differences can be pretty important. And the first type you'll probably have in mind, and what we'll mostly be talking about today, is a grant. And a grant essentially refers to funds provided to support specific activities undertaken for public benefit. So you can get a grant for a program that would address a specific problem that's been identified in your community, or you can get a grant for research to advance scientific knowledge that's important for society. But when you receive a grant, you're accountable to the party who gave you the funds to show that you're using them as they intended for those activities. And a lot of the rules and regulations and restrictions attached to grants are in place just to make sure that that's happening, but their intention is to make sure that the public good is being served by the activities. So a contract is a little different. A contract is a legally binding agreement to deliver goods or services for someone's benefit in exchange for funding that they've provided to you. Essentially, you're doing work for this other party and they expect you to complete the work. And so you're accountable to them to make sure that the work is completed. So with contracts, there's an emphasis on specific deliverables and work products. And of course, it's likely that the work you're doing will ultimately also have a public benefit, but your responsibility is to make sure that the work is completed to the satisfaction of the funder. A subaward or a subcontract is when funds from a grant or contract are awarded to one party, and then that party in turn awards a portion of the funds to a third party to complete a part of the work under their oversight. And this is a common way that community organizations can receive funding from larger agencies, and we'll talk about that more soon. A cooperative agreement is an agreement to work closely together with the funding provider on a specific project. So this is a lot like a grant, except that the funder has not only a lot more oversight over your work, but they expect you to actually work alongside them. So you may be having regular meetings with them or very frequent communications and close collaboration on your project. And one broad category of funding is what I'll call training and career development awards. And this would include scholarships, fellowships, and training awards. These are funds that pay a stipend or other expenses for individuals to support their education and training at specific stages of their career. And these can be thought of as a type of grant, and often they are called grants, but their purpose is to help the individual become educated and trained and able to contribute to a certain field, ultimately for the public benefit. Lastly, a charitable donation is when funds are given to support an organization or an individual or a cause in a general way. So sometimes there can be a fine line between a donation and a grant, but generally speaking, a donation has fewer accountability requirements and fewer spending restrictions, if any. So for a community organization, donations are typically the best way to get unrestricted funds, and that's the role of fundraisers. So for this workshop, we're mostly going to be focusing on the other mechanisms that typically require you to go through an application process, and they're usually competitive. So these are the terms to keep in mind as you look at different funding opportunities available. And it's important to know what's really involved and what's expected of you when you receive these funds. So now let's take a minute to cover some common terminology that you'll see when looking at funding opportunities and writing your proposals. So first, there's what may be called a pre-announcement or sometimes a pre-solicitation or a forecast. And that's when an agency foresees that they'll have money available to spend out in the future, and they intend to award the funds in the form of grants or contracts, but they're not yet ready to put the announcement out. And that may be because they don't have a confirmation of how much they'll have to spend, or they just haven't finalized their grant plans, but for now they want to make it known to the public that they will be offering grants or contracts in the indefinite future. And so if you see one of these, it's great because you can start planning on what to apply for and get your teams in place and learn more about the agency and keep your eye out for the announcement when it comes. And when the announcement does come out, it may be called a funding opportunity announcement or a FOA. Here I'll put a list of other common terms that you might see used to refer to the actual funding opportunity. And some of these terms are more or less interchangeable. Some agencies use one over another, and you'll get more used to seeing some if you work with those agencies all the time. But I'll note that request for proposal or RFP and maybe also solicitation, those are especially used if it's a contract opportunity as opposed to a grant. But essentially they all refer to the same thing, which is the full official announcement for a funding opportunity, complete with the full submission guidelines and the due date. So at this point, you'll have enough information to actually start your application. The scope of work is the official description of the work that would be expected of you if you receive the funds. And it might be defined for you in the funding opportunity announcement, or it may be something that you have to define in detail as part of your proposal. A letter of intent is a usually brief letter or form that you may or may not be required to submit before your full proposal. And it's to let the sponsor know that you're interested in applying. And it may be that they just want to have it for planning purposes, or they might use it as a pre-screening step to determine whether they are going to invite you to submit the full proposal. So just check for that really carefully to see if an LOI is required and how they'll use it and what's the deadline. And note that later in our presentation, we'll be talking about a slightly different concept called a letter of inquiry, which is also used for some funders. A letter of support or a letter of commitment, those are letters from your supporters and or your partners and collaborators that are included with your proposal to confirm their support for your project, and it may define their role on the project. And these letters may be voluntary, you may just include them to strengthen your proposal, or they may actually be required. An MOU, a memorandum of understanding, that's a full formal agreement between partners on a project defining their roles and responsibilities. And you may be required to include that in your proposal, or it may only be required after you get the funds, but before work begins. And finally, what you really want to see, of course, is the notice of award. And that means you've been successfully awarded the funds, and it officially outlines how you're expected to perform. And it may also be called an agreement or a contract. So now let's talk about funding sources themselves, and I'll break it out this way in the presentation. So public sources of funds mean that the dollars ultimately come from tax revenue, so they're awarded through a government, and therefore they can be federal, state, or local. Private funding can come through foundations, professional organizations, or through corporate philanthropy programs, and also, of course, individual donations through fundraising. And I've broken out institutional as a separate category, even though these funds also come through public or private channels. But these are special funding mechanisms that you may have access to through your affiliation with an institution or through your collaborations. And these are internal grant programs and subaward opportunities or consortia. Now let's start by discussing federal funds. So it may be that if you're with a smaller or a community-based organization, you don't have the infrastructure or the capacity right now to apply directly for a federal grant or contract. But it's still important to learn about the major federal agencies that fund research in your field, because a lot of the smaller opportunities that are accessible to you are ultimately coming down from these agencies. And so when you apply for them, you'll need to know something about the federal agency's mission and their requirements as well. So for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which funds the fields of medicine, health, and social services. And it has 11 agencies, including a few that I've listed here that you're probably familiar with. And these are especially important for substance use and recovery programs. Now, depending on the agency you're with, there's a lot of us here, you may be interested in other federal departments like Department of Justice or HUD, but for now we're going to focus on HHS. And I'm going to spotlight a few of their agencies just to show how they operate as funding sources. So first is the National Institute on Drug Abuse, or NIDA, which is one of 27 institutes that make up the National Institutes of Health, the world's largest biomedical research agency. And NIDA focuses on research into the causes and consequences of drug use and addiction. And NIDA, of course, funded the program at UK, the Healing Communities study that's hosting this workshop. And that was actually the largest research grant ever received by UK. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, focuses on addictive and mental disorders. And they award funds to states or local governments in packages known as block grants. So for example, there's the Substance Abuse Prevention and Treatment Block Grant. And then each state will determine how to distribute those funds. And they're often given to community-based agencies that can deliver the services. But SAMHSA also has lots of opportunities for organizations to apply to directly. And their applications tend to be very detailed, and they require you to show evidence-based approaches and show that you have well-qualified partners who have a good track record and can deliver the services efficiently. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, is focused on the prevention and control of diseases and responding to public health emergencies, as we're all very well aware of. And like SAMHSA, CDC awards grants to states and local governments as well as directly to organizations. And many of their opportunities are related to substance abuse insofar as it's a major public health issue. The Health Resources and Services Administration, or HRSA, provides healthcare for people that are geographically isolated or economically or medically vulnerable. Now, I've spotlighted here a couple of HRSA's initiatives that are relevant. One is the Appalachian Regional Commission is a partnership between federal, state, and local governments in the Appalachian region to promote economic development. And HRSA offers some grants through partnerships with the ARC. And I've highlighted one example here, the INSPIRE initiative, and that's their dedicated funding stream to address substance use disorder and recovery by supporting workforce reentry. And another one of HRSA's initiatives is the National Health Service Corps Substance Use Disorder Workforce Loan Repayment Program, which they use to recruit health professionals in underserved areas who work in the recovery field. So all of these federal agencies I just mentioned and others all have their own way of doing things and their own preferred funding mechanisms, and they each have their own websites, and you'll want to explore those individually to learn about their approaches. But what they all do have in common is that they're all federal, and so they all use grants.gov as the official way to announce their opportunities, in addition to posting them on their own sites. And you can use grants.gov to search for these opportunities, and if you apply directly to any federal agency, your application will have to go through grants.gov. And their site lets you search by research topic or keywords, or by status, meaning is it forecasted, currently posted, or closed, by funding instrument type, so is it a grant, contract, cooperative agreement, by the eligibility of the applicant, so can you apply for your university, nonprofit, or small business, by category, that means the subject area using their categories, or by the federal funding agency, for example, SAMHSA or HRSA, or any of those we've discussed, or others outside HHS like Department of Labor, Department of Justice, or HUD. They're all listed on their site. So this is one reason it helps to have a basic understanding of these terms and these agencies beforehand so that you'll know what you're looking at when you go to grants.gov. And you can register for an account on grants.gov, and that way you can subscribe to saved searches. And here's how the search page for grants.gov looks, showing how you can do a search by those parameters. So it's really helpful, and all the information will be posted here officially, but it's also good to go to individual agency websites and do your searches there, or subscribe to searches there if they let you, because they can have a sort of a friendlier user interface sometimes, and they can give you more of the context behind the opportunities. So let's take a minute to talk about state funding specifically for Kentucky. So as I mentioned, many of the state government departments and cabinets receive their funds through federal grant programs, such as block grant programs that only award funds to the state. And then the state determines how to distribute those funds, and it's often by passing them on to organizations within the state, sometimes directly, but sometimes through grant or contract opportunities that may be competitive. And even apart from federal funds, state agencies will often fund community organizations through contracts, and some also have competitive grant programs, like a few examples that I've listed here. Now, there's not one really good go-to location for finding Kentucky state funding opportunities. And one reason for that is that these funds are typically awarded through existing pathways, which means that the state agency is already familiar with your organization and your services. And in turn, through your own work and your interactions, it's likely that you're already familiar with the cabinets and the agencies that are relevant to the work that you do. And so you should be visiting their website for news and see when they post opportunities. But I will say that the funding database Grant Station, if your organization subscribes to it, they do offer a useful way to find funding opportunities at the state level, and we'll look at that soon. Here, I'd like to mention the Kentucky Opioid Response Effort, and that's a program that's funded by SAMHSA and led by the Kentucky Department for Behavioral Health, Developmental, and Intellectual Disabilities. So they fund community partner agencies through contract arrangements. And here's an example of a request for proposals that they put out recently called a notice of funding, which really means in this case, a notice of funding opportunity. And they say they're accepting proposals from organizations with the capacity and expertise to evaluate a public health campaign seeking to reduce substance use disorder stigma in the community. So you see, this is an example of how state level funding is announced on individual agency websites. And local government funding from cities or counties, that can be even harder to find by just browsing, and your ability to find it really depends on the local networking that you already have in place. On the right here, I'm showing an example of one important established grant program, the ESR from Lexington Fayetteville County government, which funds social service agencies that address local concerns like homelessness, substance use recovery, and hunger and poverty. And I know that this program got disrupted and cut even temporarily in 2020 with COVID issues. And I think that was later restored, but it caused some real difficulty temporarily, which just showed how important that funding stream has been to local organizations. But like with state funds, local funding may be pass-through funds from state or federal programs like the block grant programs and some of the CARES Act funding, and more recently, the ARPA funds. That's an ongoing community discussion, how to allocate those funds, and that's all happening locally. So to stay on top of the local funding, I recommend that you know how your local government is organized and really keep up with the news, make use of mailing lists, information sessions, and networking. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about funding from private foundations. So foundations are typically nonprofits that are set up to focus on a specific issue or problem or a cause. In order to keep their status as foundations, they're required to keep spending out a portion of their funds, which they often do by offering grant opportunities that fit with their mission. And that's why it's important to become familiar with their mission and what they stand for to make sure your project aligns with it, and you'll want to reflect that in your proposal. And my colleague Eric will be talking about that in more detail in a later session of the workshop. Right now, I'm looking at that in the context of doing your initial funding search and comparing and contrasting different foundations. And it's really hard to generalize about foundations because there's huge variation in how large they are, how well established they are, and how much funding they might offer, and what their requirements and expectations are. So you really need to become familiar with them beforehand by visiting their website, going to the webinars, and really reading mailing lists and so forth. And now I'm going to highlight just a few foundations that are relevant to substance use and recovery. And it's by no means exhaustive or even necessarily representative of what's out there, but I'm also just wanting to give you a sense of the wide range of foundations and how they can differ. First, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. That's a very large, well-established foundation that's focused on health and healthcare. So the key word for them is the culture of health concept, which they mention in all their funding opportunities. And they're focused largely on healthcare systems, health policy, and social determinants of health. And they're also heavily focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and alleviating health disparities. And they have several opportunities that are open year-round, and they also issue several specific calls for applications every year. Next is the Foundation for Opioid Response Efforts. So this is a national foundation, but it was established just in 2018 to focus on addressing the opioid crisis. And so far, they've awarded just 45 grants over those 3 years. And they state on their website that they focus on patient-centered, evidence-based approaches in these 4 program areas listed here. And they also state, and this is important, that they don't accept unsolicited proposals. So you have to apply to one of their specific RFPs that are listed on their site. And last I looked, there was only one open, and I think it closed just yesterday, the 20th. But by looking at their history on the site, they open periodically every few months a new RFP. So you might want to keep track of that by signing up for their mailing list. Now here's a local one, the Bluegrass Community Foundation, and they were established in 1967, and they administer hundreds of charitable funds, and they award small grants to support nonprofits in Central and Eastern Kentucky. And notice that their mission is all about promoting philanthropy and community engagement itself, so they don't really have one strong issue-oriented focus, although some of their grant programs do focus on specific causes or themes in the community, and they might be specific to certain counties. And they also consider themselves a general resource to support local nonprofits. So they have various tools and they host events, and they have a free newsletter that you can sign up for called the Grant Station Insider to get grant opportunities. Here's a very different example, the Drug Policy Alliance. So this is an organization with a specific policy position and goals to reduce harms of drug use and drug prohibition. And so they want to support nonprofits that are aligned with that approach. And they have a grant program that offers general operating support for organizations, and that's not particularly common among foundations. So that's noteworthy. And I hope with these few examples, you can get a sense of the wide range and scope of what foundations are and what they can fund. So let's talk about corporate giving. So as you may know, many businesses do something called corporate responsibility. And I put the scare quotes around it not to indicate skepticism or anything, but just because that's the term that you often see on their website if you look for their giving programs. And it's the way the business wants to show that it's making a positive impact on society or the community. And one way that they do that is by offering funds to community organizations. And they may have a foundation set up or a separate philanthropic arm that they keep separate from their for-profit activities to do their grant making. And they typically choose several focus areas, meaning issues that they want to support. And those may be somehow related to the business that they do or their brand image. So for instance, banks often support financial literacy, home ownership, and insurance companies might support safety programs like that. But often they're much broader than you might guess, knowing what the business does. And another important thing is that they typically look to support their geographic location where they do business. So what that means is you want to be aware of major businesses that operate in your area, or especially if they have headquarters in your area, and see what their giving programs are. Note that there's a distinction between grant programs versus donation programs, where you simply request funds to support your organization. So the grants are typically to support a specific activity or program, and they have a structured application process. The donation requests typically are for small amounts, and those are good if you're doing a one-time event, or if you want an in-kind donation of goods for some event that you're holding. And if you establish a long-term relationship with the company, they may be interested in providing a larger donation. And that kind of thing falls under general fundraising or philanthropy. You may have somebody at your organization who specializes in building those relationships for those funding streams. But right now, we're mostly talking about competitive grant opportunities when they have those. Here's an example of a corporate grant program in Kentucky. The utility program LG&E and KU has a foundation with a community grants program that opens in October. And you'll find it on their website under those words, community and corporate responsibility. Here's another example of a large national company, State Farm Insurance Company. Again, under their corporate responsibility tab, they have a community grants program. And they list their focus areas as safety, community development, and education. And there's more details at the link as to what exactly they mean by those. So let's take a minute to talk about funding available through professional organizations. So typically they require you to be a member of their organization to apply for their funding. And they typically offer these types of funding listed: fellowships, scholarships, training awards, achievement awards, and also research and travel awards. So this can be an option for funding individuals at various career stages, but occasionally they do offer funding for projects. It's important to note that they can be a good source of news and alerts about funding opportunities relevant to your field, even if they don't themselves offer funding. Here's just a list of examples of professional organizations related to substance use recovery. And I'm sure you can think of many more, but these all offer funding of some of the types I mentioned, or they're just good for networking to find out about other resources. So you may want to look into any that would apply to you and your career. Now I want to talk about the funding types I call institutional funding opportunities, because those might be especially important if you're a smaller organization and maybe haven't been awarded a major grant before. So essentially, these are ways to get funding through your existing affiliations and relationships. So internal grants are awarded within your institution if you're a large institution like UK. And they're not typically too highly competitive since you're up against other people at your institution. And their whole purpose is to support your work and distribute the funds. So stay connected within your institution and read all your emails so you can jump on these if they are available. Pilot grants are small awards that help you do some preliminary work on a project or gather data to develop an idea to get you to the point where you're ready to apply for a larger grant. And often internal grant programs are used for pilot grants. But you can also access pilot opportunities through other grant programs. Sub-awards, as we mentioned, are when a primary entity receives a grant and agrees that a partner will receive a portion of the funds to do a portion of the work. So if you're a smaller organization, you might go in on a larger grant application with a larger institution as the lead applicant if you already have an established relationship with them and they know that you can do the work. And there might also be multiple partners all doing parts of the work as a team effort, which might be called a consortium agreement. And it might be arranged where all of them, except for the primary applicant, are receiving their funding through sub-awards. But this is a path to major funding streams if your organization doesn't have the full infrastructure for a standalone application at this point. I'll finish out this portion of the presentation by talking about tools you can use to search for opportunities. So I spent a lot of time here covering the basic types of funding and introducing some sample sponsors, because what I want to emphasize is that the best way to find new opportunities is not just by doing a desperate search to find some secret funding source you never heard of before, but it's by getting to know the most relevant, high quality funding sources in advance and doing your research and really getting a sense of what what they stand for and what their funding strategy is before they ever issue an opportunity. Because remember that the really good funding agencies are not just money machines for you, but they're typically an organization that's doing their own work in your field, and you can be interested in them in its own, you can be interested in their work in its own right. And it's also a real benefit to you to get funded by the agencies that are best aligned with your work in your field, because they're the ones that really understand your needs and what you need the money for and the difficulties and the challenges that you face. So some of the smaller corporate grant programs might not be as in touch with that as well as some of the mainstream ones might. So I strongly suggest that you get on mailing lists, and even if you don't read every word of everything they send you, because we're all busy, of course, but just be aware, because when they do come out with an opportunity, then you'll already be spending weeks and months thinking about how your work aligns with theirs, and that'll really help strengthen your application. And a second good strategy is to network in your field, not just to learn about new opportunities, but to learn from people who have already been funded by this or that foundation or whatever, and hear about their experience. And also because you can apply for funding together with those agencies, like we discussed. And lastly, I'll talk about funding databases. So these are services that keep a searchable catalog of funding opportunities that they update regularly to make it easy for you to search for them all in one place. And typically they'll let you search by parameters like grantee type, for example, which grants are better for smaller nonprofits versus universities, or by sponsor type or geographic location. And they'll also usually let you, or they might let you create a profile or save your search criteria. And I'll stress again that the best way to access these databases is through an institutional subscription like UK or another free source. So note that public libraries often subscribe to grants databases. So for example, here's a page of the Lexington Public Library website showing some grants resources for nonprofits, including Foundation Directory Online, which is a database for finding foundation grants. And there you can get a lot of good information about a foundation's history of awarded grants. Things that should be on their website, but it's kind of an objective third-party source. Here's a popular database called GrantStation, where you can get an institutional membership. And I wanted to call out GrantStation as an example because it has a very useful way to search for Kentucky state funding. As you can see here, it has under Kentucky both contracts and grants that are organized by subject. Here's another database called Pivot, which you can access through UK subscription if you have access to UK system. And it's geared for academic research institutions, but it can also locate public and private funding, including some for community organizations. So here's where I've done a fairly simple search on Pivot for the term substance use and community. And I've specified a funding amount of less than $50,000. And the full page will let you search by all other parameters like funding type, applicant type, and so on. But searching using just these two parameters, it gives me 6 results. And if you look at these, you'll see 4 from NIDA, the federal source we talked about earlier. There's also 1 from a professional organization, APA, that we also talked about, and also 1 from a foundation. So you would then click on those to get more detail and eventually go on to their website. But that's just an example of how one of these operates. And here's some overall tips for working with funding databases. First, I'd recommend that you use them just as a starting point for becoming familiar with funding sources you haven't heard about, even if they're not offering any opportunities right now, but getting them on your radar for future reference so that if you can set up a system of alerts and reminders to come back to those. And when you get a search result, you'll always have to go to the funder's website to investigate directly because the database might turn up out-of-date information or not have the full guidelines. I want to end with a note to be cautious because grants are a popular search topic since everybody needs more funding, right? And there's a lot of services out there that will promise to find grants for you for various fees. And of course, their goal is to make you believe that there's lots of grant opportunities out there that you would never find without their help. But be very careful about that. And the best bet's to consult with your own institution first, any institution that you have a connection with, or even a public library. And you can always go directly to publicly available sites like grants.gov and use their resources. Because remember, the best funders are not trying to hide their opportunities. They really want to spend the funds on worthy organizations and they want you to find them. So you can go very far with your funding goals just by looking at the easily accessible mainstream information and just focusing on quality over quantity. So I hope this section has given you some ideas. And I'll add that after this workshop, along with our presentation slides and notes, we will be giving you your own starter customized list of some funding sources for you to look at that are relevant to substance use recovery. So that'll be helpful, I hope. So now let's move on to part 2. So far we've been talking about how to find funding opportunities, and for the remainder of this section, we're going to focus on how to actually read and evaluate the funding opportunity you found to see if it's something that you can pursue and want to pursue. Once you get a full funding opportunity, there's some essential information that you need to find, and I've broken it down into the issues: time, money, eligibility, and instructions. So we'll go over each of these in turn. One of the first things to zero in on, of course, is the due date. So sometimes that right there determines whether or not you can go for it. And sometimes there's a little more to look into regarding the deadline than just one date. So first, is there really only one single drop dead deadline, or is it a rolling submissions opportunity? Will they take them any time of year? And even if they take them anytime, is it best to submit at certain times? So for example, sometimes they'll announce that they collect proposals year round, but they review them 2 or 3 times a year. So you want to get in before their next review. Or sometimes they'll say it's best to apply as soon as possible in the fiscal year before their money runs out. So there can be nuances there. But assuming there's one deadline, pay attention to whether they specify the time of day. Does that mean 5 p.m. or does it mean midnight? And even the time zone, you'd be surprised how often that can be an issue. And also consider that the application may have multiple components that each have their own due date. So sometimes they require the letter of intent or pre-application before the main proposals do. And there may be recommendation letters that may be submitted separately. So check for those details. I want to emphasize that you need to keep in mind internal deadlines. And this is something that no funding opportunity can tell you, because they don't know what's going on inside your institution or in your life. So you may have an internal deadline a few days in advance of the funder's deadline because of some work that needs to be done within your institution before you submit. And that could include completing registrations or an internal review process. There's typically an approvals or a routing process for any grant application that you submit to make sure everybody in your organization knows about it and is in agreement. And with all the people that are getting involved in getting the grant together, there can be various delays, of course, with different components like letters of support or collaboration that you need from other people outside your organization. And also you might want to send your proposal out for other people to review and give you feedback, which is a wonderful idea, but it can also bring its own delays. So when you look at a deadline, you have to factor in all of those things. So let's consider the project period. Does the opportunity specify when the work that's being funded has to start, or do you maybe get to decide that yourself within a range? Also, what's the performance period that's going to be used to evaluate whether you've met their expectations? And are there certain budget periods, and are there deliverables or reports that will be due on a certain schedule? And how does all that fit in with your other professional and personal responsibilities? Is that feasible for you? Now let's talk about the money itself. So what is the total funding amount that they're going to offer? And is that broken down by year? And are they giving you the funds all at once in a lump sum or in increments? So NIH, for example, with most of its awards, gives funding each year contingent on performance the previous year. And some awards will give you the funds all up front, or the contract is possible you won't receive some, or hopefully not all of the funds until you've reached certain milestones, but that can happen. So whatever the agreement is this something that will work for your organization in terms of cash flow? Now ask, what are you actually able to spend those funds on? What will the budget cover? And here are some typical categories of items that you would have in a budget. And I've seen opportunities that are limited to only one of these, or that might exclude any of these. And so ultimately you have to ask yourself, will the opportunity pay for everything you actually need to complete the project? And if not, how will you cover the rest? Here are 2 very important terms to keep in mind regarding budget restrictions. The term indirect costs, sometimes it's called overhead, or F&A, facilities and administrative costs. But these are costs in a grant award that go to support not your specific project, but the overall supportive infrastructure of your organization, such as the building, the utilities, the supportive offices like your HR department, and so on. And these are real costs that your organization has to cover some way or another. And your funding opportunity will specify whether and how much they'll cover in indirect costs. And then your institution may have a say in whether they'll even accept the award at that rate. So your organization might have an agreement with the government called an indirect cost rate agreement that specifies the percentage that you're permitted to request on federal grants. And some private funders will honor that rate and others won't. And they may offer what's called a de minimis rate, or like of 10%, or they might not cover indirect costs at all. And this can be a big issue when drawing up your budget. So make sure you learn their rules as soon as you can, as well as your organization's rules and their needs. Another important term is cost share, sometimes called match. And that's when your institution has to contribute some of its own resources to supplement the funds before they'll agree to give you the award. And you'll need to know whether you're required to give match or if the sponsor encourages it, and if so, whether your organization is willing and able to provide that match. Let's talk about eligibility. First, you'll want to be clear on whether this is an award that you must apply for as an institution or as an individual. So generally, funding agencies expect to be making their awards to institutions rather than individuals. An exception might be a smaller scholarship or career award, but usually it's to your whole organization, assuming that you'll be using the resources of the organization to get the work done. So even though you personally are doing the work, the award is officially made through the institution, and that means you have to apply through your institution. The key question is, when you receive the award or the contract, will it be made personally to you or to your institution? Now, assuming it is your institution, you have to check whether you're eligible as an applicant, or the institution is eligible. Here are some examples, not all, but these are examples of types of eligibility categories for institutions that may be listed on, sorry about that. Here's where that may be listed on your opportunity. It might be specified. And it may be that some opportunities set aside funds for a certain type of organization. Sorry. This is the one that we're on. So check and make sure that the funding opportunity specifies that your type of institution is eligible. Let's consider some special circumstances that may pertain with a funding opportunity. So some opportunities have limited submission, meaning they'll only accept one or a limited number of submissions from a single institution. So if you're at a really large institution like UK, it could happen that two people try to apply for the same opportunity, but the funder won't accept two applications from both of you, so they may disqualify one or both of them. So of course you don't want that to happen, so you need to have a system set up to prevent that. With some opportunities, it matters whether your organization has received a certain award before. It might say that you can only apply if you've been awarded something previously, or it might mean that you can't apply if you've received something previously. And that could apply either to the institution or the investigator. Next, you'll want to consider if there are any restrictions or requirements involving partners or subawardees or subcontractors. And if you do have any of these, they will likely have their own eligibility requirements. So you have to check for that. Looking at the project lead, who might be called the principal investigator if it's a research project, but whoever the individual is that's officially in charge of the program, there may be special eligibility requirements for them, even if the proposal is going through the institution and not that individual. There may be certain qualifications, or they might look at prior award status or whether you're a member of an association. You need to consider whether the project you're wanting to fund meets their eligibility requirements. Some opportunities may only be open to you, for example, if you're in certain areas of the country, or they may require you to serve certain populations. For instance, you might need to show you're going to provide healthcare that benefits residents in rural areas at a certain percentage. And more broadly, of course, just project has to fit the sponsor's intentions and expectations. And so you have to read all their definitions very carefully. So terms like Appalachia, for instance, or even rural might be different for different funders. Look out for how they define it. Eric will be talking more in his presentation about some of the broader issues of making sure your project scope is a fit for the opportunity. But the basic facts of eligibility are things that you want to establish right away. Your funding opportunity or the agency guidelines should tell you how to submit your application. There may be a special submissions portal you have to use. It may require you to register, sometimes days or weeks in advance. And one thing you need to know is who actually presses the submit button. Note that this is not necessarily the same person who is the official applicant or the person that actually wrote the application. It may be that you personally are submitting the application, even though you're applying through the institution with their approval, but you're the one who actually sits at the computer and submits it. But with larger federal proposals, and if you're a larger organization, it may be a designated grant staff or a whole office that personally submits the proposal. But whichever it is, you need to know it early on because it'll help with your planning and help you prevent a last-minute emergency. Here's where I'll stop to emphasize that you should be familiar and in good working terms with the grant staff at your institution before you start thinking about applying for a grant. Now, if you're a smaller organization, it may be that you are the grants person or there is no separate grants person, and you need to read all of the instructions carefully yourself. But if you're at a larger organization, you might have a separate office or a designated person whose role is to submit and administer grants, and they take care of all the registrations that you need for the large federal grants. And regardless, there will be an individual somewhere in the organization called the authorized organizational representative, and that's the official person who authorizes all the grants and signs all the contracts on behalf of the institution. If you have grants offices, they'll have their own internal policies and procedures that you need to work with to apply. And it can seem really onerous that they have extra deadlines and restrictions, but the trade-off for that is that they can help and take care of a lot of these issues that I mentioned and can give guidance. So it's never too early to get in contact with these offices or these staff members and let them know your plans so that you can make use of their resources and assistance if that's available. Going back to what you look for in your funding opportunity, you should find some instructions for how to complete the proposal down to details for formatting documents and page length and what to call your attachments, how to upload them, and so forth. Note that there will be some guidelines that are specific to the opportunity, and then there are some that are standard for the entire funding agency, and those are your default when the funding opportunity doesn't specify something. So for the big federal agencies, these agency-wide guidelines can be large, detailed documents that can run hundreds of pages. But for the smaller funders, it's typically just a few pages somewhere on their website specifying what they will or will not fund. But whatever it is, just make sure that you read all the available material relating to grants, whatever it may be. Many opportunities also will tell you in detail what the standards are that they'll be using to judge your application. And that's a very valuable tool for shaping your application. And you'll be hearing more about that in our next session after the break, which focuses on how to write a strong proposal. But in summary, you evaluate a funding opportunity by asking, 1, is the timeline feasible? 2, will the funding really meet your needs? 3, are you sure that you're eligible? And 4, do you have all the information that you need to apply? So this concludes my portion of the presentation. I hope you found it informative, and I'm ready to address questions in any time that we have left before the break. It looks like there's a few minutes.
Thanks, Lou. This was great, this information. Just a comment here in the chat box, and please feel free to, again, use the raise hand feature or type your question in the chat box and we can read it. But one person's commenting that you must keep in mind if your costs are allowable, reasonable, and necessary, those terms show up when you write your grant and at audit time for how you spend your funds.
Oh, totally. Yes. And those words have specific meaning for federal grants, especially. But just even in the looser meanings, that's something that's important for even the smaller funding opportunities that maybe haven't defined these things in full detail. That's something that you definitely have to show when writing your budget and writing your proposal, to show how the budget really tells the story in your proposal of what you're going to do and that it's justified that you're using the funds in this way.
Any other questions? Okay. Not seeing any. What we'll do here is take a 5-minute break. I have 10:48 on my computer here, and we'll come back at 10:53 to start the second session with Eric and Kathy. So give you a chance to just get up and get a drink or go to the bathroom, whatever, and we'll start right promptly at 10:53.
So Lisa, I'm going to go ahead and pull the slides up if that's
Yep.
okay with you.
Absolutely. Go ahead. I think Lou already stopped sharing.
Kathy,
Yes,
can I just pull mine up for a second just to try something?
yes.
Okay,
Hold on, let me stop it.
okay, thanks. I just want to make sure I've got the right view. Are you able to see that, Kathy?
Yes, but I think you have to.
We also see your
Wow.
notes.
Oh, can you tell me again how to take that? Just
Yep.
have,
Display
Right there.
squad settings and then swap. Yes, there you go. But I think it's not on your first slide.
right.
Yeah,
Oh,
okay.
okay, but it looks good.
Yes. that's
Okay, thank you. I'll stop sharing. Thanks.
Okay, Kathy, I have 10:53.
Okay, I'll go right ahead and
Over.
start. I'm Kathy Gretsch, Executive Director of the University of Kentucky Proposal Development Office, and I want to start by expressing my thanks for this opportunity to talk with you about basic grantsmanship, a framework for success. We have two parts to this session. I will handle the first part, and my colleague Eric David Schofer will move into the second one. All right, so now let's see. Part one is proposal, structure, and strategy. And as you heard from Lou, there's a whole lot to know about the funding landscape. So you start broad. You know the funding landscape. And again, among the potential sponsors, federal and private grantors, you recognize that they have different missions and different priorities, different programs, different funding mechanisms. And so your goal in the first place is to match your idea, your specialty, to the right sponsor and the right program. And so you start by planning. You start by focusing on sponsor priorities. So you really want to know, what is it they want to achieve? So you're doing your research, you're reviewing carefully all of this type of information that Lou provided, sponsor web pages, mission and priorities, organizational history, the awarded grants. You're talking extensively with funded peers, because in the end, when you actually start to write this grant application, you want to analyze the match between your goals and their needs. And so when we begin writing a proposal, usually we're very excited about the possibility to do an important project, the pool of money we're going to get to carry out some urgently needed tasks. But in the end, it is not really as much about your goals as it is about their needs and their priorities. So what's in it for the sponsor? Why would the sponsor want to buy your idea? And that's really what this kind of transaction is a sponsor, a funding agency is buying whatever it is that you can do to achieve their priorities. And so at the heart of it, how does your project accomplish the sponsor's goals? And that sort of mindset is what drives everything you do as you develop that proposal. So if you're going to compete effectively, you write to the sponsor's goals and priorities to sell your project. Now, I'd like to talk in the proposal planning phase about avoiding holes in a proposal. So the writing process occurs after significant planning. So you have this wonderful idea, but before you can begin to develop a proposal, there's a gap or needs analysis. You know, what is it? What is the gap in practice or understanding or knowledge that your study, your project, your program is going to deliver? You collect early data and evidence to support your project rationale, because the idea as it stands alone is usually insufficient to support a convincing argument for funding. You identify strong collaborators with the right expertise. And I want to talk a little bit about the teaming that you might do, particularly since so many of you are in organizations that work very collaboratively with others. When you pick those collaborators, you really want to make sure that those people are chosen not because, you know, they need a grant too, or they put you on their grant, but really because they have the right expertise for the set of tasks that you intend for them to do. If they don't, then reviewers are going to criticize your application because they can't see why someone has been put on a grant, and they can't figure out how they fit the role that's envisioned. You want to spend some time getting the commitments and the documentation of the collaborator and partner expertise. It's not enough in your proposal to simply say, we're going to partner with thus and such, so-and-so, without having evidence that they are on board and that they are willing to participate. So in the end, what you're doing is extensive project development, and you're doing it with your committed partners, not just alone and then telling them afterwards, oh, this is what I proposed for us, and you'll have a role on it. You're doing this together. You're building whatever the project is, planning it in detail, and you have laid extensive groundwork. And at the end, if your proposal is submitted, that proposed project is ready to launch. So I'll give you an example. We have had major grant awards come into UK that had start dates of October 1st, and the notice of grant award came September 30th. And the expectation was that you do not have time October 1st to continue to plan and figure out who does what and how you're going to proceed, that you launch that project right away when you get that notice of grant award. So your project development that leads into this proposal basically sets the stage when they say, we're giving you the money, here it is, that you're ready to go. We strongly recommend that you follow the sponsor's proposal outline. So structured proposals, these are ones to federal agencies and some private foundations that spell out exactly what the sponsor asks to see. And so you want to pay really close attention to what they expect you to include in that proposal. And we recommend that you read and reread and reread and follow the guidelines strictly. And I know that very many people who do grants training will say that, and it can sound kind of lame. But if someone comes to me and they say, I am submitting to thus and such foundation, here's the link to the guidelines, will you help? The first thing that I do, or my staff as well, is we pull up the guidelines and we read the guidelines. And as we continue to work on that project, we reread the guidelines. We are constantly keeping an eye on what did they tell us we had to deliver in the proposal? What did they tell us we had to deliver in carrying out the project? So you use the outline structure provided in the solicitation. If you decide, and sometimes this happens, sometimes you look at it and you're like, oh, whoever wrote this did not know how to write a solicitation. I could have done a better job. I think if I lay it out this way, it'll be more effective. Well, you may be right, but you deviate at your own risk, because reviewers are very comfortable with the specified order and flow and required content, and you confuse them when you come up with your own outline. So you include all specified content, you use the sponsor's section headings with their words, and you do it in a way that's reviewer friendly, that makes specific content easy to find. So I will say that at UK, we in my office mostly help people develop their grant applications, but occasionally we do write an institutional grant application. And when that is the case, what I do is I start with the outline provided, and I basically copy it into the document as the initial draft. And I will keep the specifics for each section that's specified in front of me, either in a comment box or bracketed beneath the heading in the document. And as that document develops and we start filling in information for each subtopic, we then assess, did we do what they asked us to do? Did we deliver entirely? And only then will we take that set of instructions out, leaving just the subtopic heading. And so I want to give you a sample from the Foundation for Opioid Response Efforts. They have an RFP. Here's the outline that they provided. Now notice that the first step for this particular sponsor is to have a concept note. So they basically are telling you, here is exactly what you need to put in this concept note. And it's very specifically laid out. They're saying immediate unmet need. That becomes my first subtopic heading. And I pay really close attention to the fact they want 100 words. So, you know, when they say 100 words, they mean 100 words. I don't do 102. I don't do 105. Thinking, oh, well, I only put 45 in that next one, anticipated project goal, which I'm allowed 50. You have to stick to what they say, or they could toss your proposal without review. Then they tell you to move on from the anticipated project goal to the strategy and approach to achieve that goal, the expected outcomes, the impact it'll have on patients, vulnerable families and communities, and or the field. So you define where that impact will be. You briefly describe your organization and its qualifications. And then you note that they are basically telling you, be attentive to our guidelines, because they are going to judge the concept notes by responsiveness to the RFP and alignment with FOR's mission and interests. Remember, I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that basically they want to fund you when you meet their goals and their priorities, their mission and their interest. So for example, if I were going to outline this concept note, this is how I would set it up. I would have unmet need. I would take the max 100 words out after I finished writing it, anticipated project goal, strategy and approach, etc. All the things that were highlighted in that set of guidelines. And that is how I structure the proposal. The other thing you want to keep in mind when you're actually writing the proposal is that there are reviewers out there, and they can be very different in terms of expertise from what you and those in your organization who are going to participate in the project have. And so you have to keep an eye on what those reviewers may need in order to review this effectively and to support a funding recommendation. They don't usually have any decision in the funding process, but they definitely provide a critique that will inform the sponsor whether they might want to fund. And so your grant application must reflect your knowledge of the sponsor's proposal conventions and speak the language of the agency. So if they talk about state objectives, you call them objectives. if they say milestones, you have a part that lays out milestones. If they have a certain way of describing their significance, their innovation, such as impact, if they mention expected outcomes, you use those terms, you use the language of the agency, and you basically are following the sponsor's formula and layout. So in the end, what you're doing is you're writing for that audience. If they tell you the font has to be, 1 inch, single space, with Arial 11 or Times New Roman 12, you follow that exactly, even if you don't like that font, or if you think it looks better with a different margin or different spacing. Basically, all of that communicates that you are someone who knows how to play their game. So you're using their terms and phrasing. And I also caution people to fill the allowed space for each section. So a lot of times there's a document that says 1-page limit. And sometimes we'll be working with a principal investigator or a program director, and they'll give us 3/4 of a page. And my experience is that the people you're competing with will use every bit of that space. It's valuable real estate to make their case. And so if you only use 3/4 or 2/3 of the page, you're sort of cheating yourself. You're giving yourself less opportunity to lay out everything that you can to make a convincing rationale for your proposal, and others may be taking full advantage. So I like to think about who these reviewers are and what they might need in order to understand the concept. And so one of the questions we ask is, what kind of readers are they? Are they visual versus textual readers? So a lot of times principal investigators or program directors will come to us and they'll say, so if I set it in the text, do I need to have a graphic? Or I put it in a graphic, do I need to have it in the text? And the truth is, there are different readers. So for example, I'm a textual reader. I like the balance that's provided when you put in visuals and graphics. They're really important. But when I'm reading as a reviewer, I get most of my information from the words. I will only lightly look at the graphics, but I know other reviewers who are on our campus who tell me, I start by looking at the graphics. I look at the visuals, and then I read the text. So they are very much pulling their understanding from the graphics, the figures, the tables, the diagram. So usually what you have, particularly in complex proposals, is parallel content, where you have it graphically displayed, but you explain it in the text. Now, there are some very short proposals where there may not be any space at all for figures and tables. So if the standard of the sponsor is a 2-page proposal and pretty much everyone does just text, then of course that's what you would do. When you're thinking about reviewers, you also want to make it really easy for them to understand your content. And so what we recommend is what I call the 4S strategy of audience-centered communication for your major discussion points. So you're going to start with a signpost, and a lot of times it's bolded or underlined or italicized subheadings. It's within that content, the paragraphs that make up that discussion in figures, diagrams, charts. So you're signaling what the content is that they could expect. Then state. You open each discussion point with a key point or topic sentence so that the reader knows here's what's about to come in the information that follows. And I will say that reviewers of grant proposals tend to be very skeptical. If you just state it, if you just say this is the case, they usually are doubtful. They're not willing to just accept your assurance. So the expectation is that you're going to support what you said. You're going to provide evidence. So you're going to tell them this is so, and then you're going to show them the support for that statement, the evidence for that statement. And then you summarize. You pause periodically to interpret and lead reviewer feelings, reviewer thinking. So sometimes when we get a rejected proposal back and we're reading the critiques and we're all very disappointed, and we're like, how did that reviewer wind up way out there in left field? And a lot of times it's because you gave them the information and you thought they were going to get the meaning from it that you do. And instead, what they needed was for you to say, here are the implications. This taken together, this evidence suggests or whatever, however you want to phrase it, you summarize what the meaning of all this information is that you just presented. You want to avoid long, unbroken expanses of text. And so you don't want your document to look like this, just cram packed. Even if you only have 1 page or 2 pages, you still need a tiny bit of white space with some blank lines or half lines between paragraphs, partial lines, short digestible blocks of text, visual interest, as I mentioned, if it's appropriate to the grant program, like figures and graphics. You need to give them something that's relatively easy to read. When you look at the proposal as a whole, basically, it doesn't matter where you are submitting. Almost every proposal answers key content structuring questions that help to pitch that idea. So what are you going to do? Why is that significant or important work? And I have to say that second one is really, really important, because you may lay out what you're going to do and think they're going to get it. And a lot of times they don't. And so you tell them explicitly why it's significant or important. How are you going to do it? What steps are you going to take? What are the strategies? What are the approaches? Who is going to do what? And this is where the expertise that you've assembled comes into play. Are they the right people to do whatever the tasks are? When are the steps to be performed? You want to show basically that you have a logical structure for the scope of work and that it can fit into whatever the funding period is, 1 year, 3 years. And then where will this lead? What are the results going to be or expected to be, and how will they have impact? Typically, you will have an overview or an aims page or an objectives page, usually 1 page that sets the stage for the whole proposal. And a lot of times, this page is structured in such a way that you try to give at least a little bit of everything that is important and significant and exciting about the project. So it answers very briefly as many of those questions as possible. This is a marketing page. So a lot of time it's building a compelling case for funding, providing that rationale in brief. It states a project goal, which is basically your direction for the project. It introduces your solution to whatever this gap is that you have come up with in your gap analysis. It defines the specific aims, the tasks or objectives. And basically, by the end of this page, hopefully you will have generated reviewer buy-in for the concept. It is sometimes, for another metaphor, the proposal in brief. When you write those goals and objectives, you really want to make sure that they are smart. This is a common sort of paradigm that's out there for writing goals and objectives, but basically they need to be specific. A lot of our work is oriented around curing cancer in Appalachia, for example, or addressing our broad region's substance abuse issues. That is a very hard thing to do in a 2-year project. And so you want to make the goal very specific. What can you achieve within the scope of your work? Can you measure that you did achieve it? You want to show that. And again, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, meaning I have these resources, this team, very relevant to the problem that we're tackling, and we can do it in the project period. And basically, if you phrase a goal that's sort of pie in the sky or way out there, and you don't really know where your work is headed, you just know there's a big, broad problem you want to address, the reviewers won't know where you're going either. So you start with these questions, the proposal, what are you going to do? Somewhere in those proposal guidelines, you will have something that indicates that you provide background or overview, you introduce the problem, the need, the challenge, or the innovation you propose to address. You clearly introduce your expertise where appropriate and your solution in non-technical language, remembering that reviewers can have lots of different expertise levels. And especially important is your rationale. What is your reasoning? What is the evidence for your approach? And why do you expect this solution to work? You articulate your aims or your objectives consistent with whatever the scope and the funding amount is, and you provide sufficient detail. You want to avoid just sort of the broad strokes, here's my idea, without the details of how this is all going to work. So I like to point out the difference between goals and objectives. Goals typically indicate overarching long-range direction or a broad statement of the targeted outcome. So for example, here's one that is funded to, it's an NIH, funded to this institute, 3C Institute for Social Development. And it's to support broad-scale dissemination and use of digital SSI modules to reach as many youth as possible with evidence-based mental health supports. So basically, that's the outcome. They're trying to provide evidence-based mental health supports to as many youth as possible. When you write your objectives, you're then breaking the goal down into smaller units, and these are specific, measurable actions to achieve the goal. They can also be outcome-based, as a goal is, where they express intended results or accomplishments. They focus on the end result, the changes in policy, a system, the environment, knowledge, attitudes, or behavior. Or they can be task-based or process objectives that focus on the activities to be completed. They represent concrete steps in the implementation process. And I will say that if you're going in for foundation applications or very mission-specific organizations, a lot of times task-based objectives are preferable. And the way you can determine this is to look at abstracts of funded projects and see how did they write their goals and objectives. And you might be using then verbs such as identify, implement, test, provide, utilize. Here's an example. This one is funded to a National Health Promotion Associates by NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, to develop task and test task an adaptation of this evidence-based substance abuse prevent approach called life skills training. So then you move to the proposal question, why? Why is that significant work? And you want to state that significance and innovation explicitly. You want to know, you want to state what the novel solution is, or what the impact on the field or a community or society on practice is, because you don't want to just lay out what you're going to do and expect reviewers to get it. And you can use the state of current practice, current understandings, the state of scholarship or science in the field to highlight significance or innovation or potential impact, but you never leave it to reviewers to determine the significance or innovation themselves. Then your task is to lay out how you're going to do it. So you provide a non-technical overview of the study design. If you have preliminary data, particularly if it's a sponsor that requires preliminary data, you provide that information and you lay out a detailed scope of the methods and approaches. And basically the whole idea is that you move your good idea to a set of clearly detailed step-by-step activities, and you avoid a broad stroke strategy with unclear implementation processes. So when you lay out that detailed scope of methods, you show enough detail that you can convey the value of the work. So when we review proposals for faculty, staff, and students at UK, one of our most frequent recommendations is, would you want to develop the details? Would you want to elaborate? Consider laying out how this will work exactly. What are the steps? Because every successful proposal is a detailed proposal. It's almost like a blueprint. It's very specific as to how this is all going to happen. So you're delineating key activities or interventions or experiments, and you're stating expected results and measures to show that you achieved your aims or your objectives. So you have assessments, you have statistical measures, you have benchmarks for success, anything that shows how it's going to happen. So you always keep in mind, you start with a good idea, but if when you write that proposal, it's still just describing a good idea, you really need to go back to the drawing board. You want a successful proposal to develop the idea into a very detailed action plan. And so I look at this as a continuum. You start with your good idea, and as you do your proposal planning, you keep moving it toward the action plan, and by laying out those very specific details. The methods, success is in the details. If you find yourself proposing ideas without processes for implementation, or if you propose plans to identify gaps or assess needs, or identify evidence-based approaches to carry out the objectives, if you plan to recruit partners, or you state that you're going to establish a cohort that's going to allow you to do the study, that they're going to participate, but you have no letters of support, no biographical sketches, no evidence that you know who these people are or that they are on board. If you have several to be named roles, in other words, if you give me the money, I'm going to hire all these people, you're probably not yet ready to write the proposal. Now you're doing all this detail, and every proposal is detailed, but you want to get to the point. You want to keep it simple. And so you adopt the Goldilocks and the Three Bears approach. You provide sufficient detail, but don't overwhelm. And you always want to keep in mind, simple sentences carry more power. So if you go back and you've drafted everything and you're going through your revision process and you see, wow, I have a sentence that's 6 lines long and it has about 5 clauses in it and, tons of qualifying adjectives. That's one where you may want to divide it into maybe 3 sentences. But you want to be a little bit careful not to do too many just plain simple sentences, because otherwise it seems choppy and the transitions or the connections between ideas don't come through. So you analyze your use of complex sentences and those with many clauses and determine, is this making it hard for them to read? Are they going to have to stop and really study this sentence? Do I need to rephrase it in a way that makes them understand it more clearly, more readily? You want to cover who's going to do what. Now, sometimes that is specified in a budget justification or in the biographical sketches. It may not necessarily be in the main proposal narrative, but somewhere in this proposal, specify who in the project is doing what activities. And somewhere you are also defining how that expertise is appropriate for whatever their role is. So for example, if you are doing some kind of a project and maybe you need, a nurse, and your project is in adults and you are really close with a pediatric nurse and you decide, well, a nurse is a nurse, I'm going to put a nurse on the project. Reviewers might come back and say, how is the expertise of a pediatric nurse appropriate to this project in an adult population that has whatever, the disease or disorder is? And the other thing you want to keep in mind is when you bring these partners on board, there should be a lot of early communication, a lot of involvement in project planning and implementation, so that they're fully on board with their roles. When are the steps to be performed? You want a clear timeline for the sequence and timing activities. And the beauty of a timeline is that it can show, yes, this is a 2-year grant. I can get it done in that 2-year time frame. So you lay out specific project activities or tasks in your timeline. And if you have a really short duration project, maybe 6 months, you want to make sure the methods can deliver results in that time frame, and you use that timeline to help show that. This part, where, is often the part that's missing. So people will lay out really a direction, what it is they're doing, why it's important, how it's going to be done, who the players are, and they leave it to reviewers and program staff at the sponsor to determine what the impact is, or to understand just from that information what the impact is. It's really important that you bring it full circle, that you take them all the way to the end. You describe your expected outcomes and impact. You step back and consider exactly why the sponsor is offering these grants. So what were their priorities that this project delivers on? What will your project enable or achieve that is not now the case? And why is that important? And you want to be really explicit in those statements so that they know that the change that you are proposing of the current state of the field or of practice or of knowledge meets what their priorities are, and this project will deliver on that change. I'd like to step back and close with the cardinal rules of grant seeking. And one is revise, revise, revise. Even if you're a really experienced grant writer, that first draft you create is rarely sufficient for your final proposal. And so there's a lot of revision that goes on, and even a lot of sharing, and others who will look at what you've written. You seek out pre-submission review from others. At the end, when you've got the proposal just about ready, red team review has become so important. In other words, you have identified some knowledgeable individual or team who will look at the proposal against the guidelines and do the critique that, or similar to what the reviewers will do. You get someone to do a gap analysis against the guidelines. So this is actually the role of the Proposal Development Office at UK. This is what we do for our faculty, staff, and students who are submitting grants. We do red team review, we do gap analysis, although we are often involved much earlier than when it's final, and we're in that revise, revise, revise part of the process. And in the end, when you've finished writing, you also want to go back to the review criteria and make sure that you have addressed them thoroughly, all of the ones that apply. The other thing I'd like to say is persistence pays. People who are getting awarded grants are submitting again and again and again. And so you want to submit lots of grants, possibly to different organizations with the same or similar concept, because you don't know if one is going to hit or not. And if you get rejected, you want to understand that lots of people get rejected and that resubmission is part of the process. And so if they offer a resubmission option, you don't worry about the fact that you didn't make it the first time. You go back in and resubmit. And with that, I will turn this session over to Eric, who's going to talk to you about a specific task within the proposal development area, writing the letter of inquiry. Eric?
All right.
I'm
Thanks.
going to stop my screen and let him pick back up with his version that he can control.
Yes. Just get this pulled up. Is everyone seeing just the slide, or do I need to swap
And
my?
you swap.
Do the slide.
All right. Is it looking good now?
Yes.
Perfect.
All right, great. Okay, so as Kathy mentioned, I'll be talking a little bit in this last portion of the presentation about foundations as being, a very viable funding source, especially it would seem for a lot of the work that a lot of you do with the HEAL grant and some of the community outreach programs that you might do. And I'll be focusing specifically on one of the very common documents that's required, specifically the letter of inquiry, or LOI, and what some of those elements are, why they're important, what some of those elements of the LOI are, why they are important. And I'll also be highlighting just the importance of this letter and basically some of the advantages to writing it for your future grant seeking. And I think you'll also notice that some of these points kind of echo what both Lou and Kathy have said, and also at the same time expand on some of those points. So just right before we actually get into the LOI and some of its components, I thought it'd be helpful to kind of give a breakdown of foundations and federal sources or federal agencies, just to note some of these fairly common differences. Again, noting that there are some individual differences that do exist depending on the particular foundation that you're looking at. But I think this is a fairly good general contrast between private foundations and federal agencies or federal sources. So for example, you'll often find that foundations tend to focus on a particular region. They'll often only serve the constituents in that region. So You might come across many foundations that, for example, target the Louisville area. But then you might look at some other foundations, opportunities from those foundations, and you see that they have a Lexington focus, that Lexington has its own foundations. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind, and also noting that that can be an advantage. You know, it's potentially a smaller applicant pool if it's looking at just, you know, organizations within the Lexington area or within a certain radius of Lexington. So that's something to keep in mind, is the region that perhaps the foundation focuses on. It's also important to note that foundations can tend to be more flexible in how often they change their rules or their focus rather quickly. Federal agencies or federal sponsors, they can do the same thing. They can change their procedures. But I think by and large, these federal agencies tend to be a little more open, maybe a little more public with their processes, perhaps sending out frequent notices or even previews of notices for when an agency, for when a procedure or a particular focus is going to be changing. So it might be on your radar more often or more early than a change that a foundation might make. So it's just important to keep that point in mind. And again, kind of going back to what both Lou and Kathy said, you know, reading and rereading those guidelines and just making sure, you know, what you read perhaps 6 months ago, and then returning to that web page 6 months later, nothing has changed in terms of the focus. So just be aware of perhaps more frequent changes happening with foundations. Another kind of contrast to keep in mind is that oftentimes foundations don't want to be the only source of funding for a particular project. One reason for that might be that foundations don't have as big of a pot of money as, say, a federal agency, or maybe a much larger private foundation like the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that Lou mentioned. Robert Wood Johnson might be an exception to that rule, but oftentimes when you're looking at foundations, you'll see much smaller pots of money. And so that they might say right on their webpage that they're looking to, you know, perhaps fund part of a project, not necessarily the entire project. So it's always a good idea to develop a number of foundations or funding sources to kind of have in your pool, and planning for each of those foundations to fund a particular component of your project. And so in your budget or your budget justification, you will be, you know, showing what particular contributions a particular foundation will be making. And so hopefully it'll come through to the sponsor, to that particular foundation that you're applying to. Okay, this is what this applicant wants from us, but they also want XYZ from this other foundation. And hopefully, you know, you're making a good case on how those requests complement each other and how they fit together. So another difference between foundations and federal agencies is that oftentimes kind of the first step with a foundation in terms of applying or gauging interest in whether they'd be interested in funding your idea is to craft this initial document, this LOI, this letter of inquiry, which we'll definitely be talking about for the majority of this presentation. But basically this document being, you know, a 1 to 2 page, basically a 1 to 2 page proposal describing all the components of your project idea. Again, trying to get your foot in the door to see if the foundation likes your idea, and if they're willing ultimately to invite you to either get more information, maybe have a phone call or conversation with you to expand on those ideas, or to even invite you to submit a full proposal. A much longer document where you have more space to develop your ideas and include more details. But I think one of the advantages to this LOI is, with it being a shorter document, you know, in a way, you're not having to worry about crafting a 10, 12, 15, maybe even 20-page document, full proposal. You know, you're just relegated to that 1 or 2 page LOI, which, to be fair, has its own challenges, because you're looking to kind of what, like Kathy was saying before, cram all of the important information, the exciting information about your project into this allotted space, which is often just 1 or 2 pages. But despite that challenge, oftentimes it doesn't take quite as long to develop this document. So in a way, it's kind of nice on the front end to develop this document, maybe not have to necessarily spend quite as much time on it, just to see at the outset, you know, does this particular foundation have an interest, or at least an initial interest in my idea? The other kind of last difference I want to highlight is that, again, generally there can be exceptions, but generally as a rule, success rates can be lower with foundations. You know, they can be as low as 10 to 15%. We've seen with some particular agencies, it might be a 5% success rate, you know, extremely competitive. Whereas, you know, maybe if you go to the NIH and one of their particular institutes like NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse, you might see success rates a little higher, maybe in the 15 to 20% range, and maybe for a specified program, a little higher, maybe 25%. So depending on the foundation and, you know, how much information they put on their website, sometimes you can get this information, and they might outright say what typically their percentage of funded applications is, or, you know, how many they funded out of the number of applicants. But I don't think this generally lower success rate should necessarily discourage you. Again, I think this goes back to doing that homework at the beginning of looking at these foundation web pages, and, you know, getting very familiar with what their mission is, their focus is, what they funded in the past. And, you know, if you do see that you fit that particular niche area, then maybe it really is a good idea to go for that foundation, despite it historically having a very low funding rate. So, you know, those are some of the main contrasts, or some of the differences between foundations and federal funding. So now let's really get into the foundations and talk about, you know, why would you consider a foundation? And some of these some of these reasons we've already alluded to. But you may be wanting to fund community engagement or community outreach efforts, depending on what programs your organization implements or offers. And so community foundations are very often a logical choice. Oftentimes you'll find that foundations like to pick up what federal agencies do not. So for a unique program that does not fit the requirements of other foundations, particularly particular larger foundations or federal agencies, you might see if there is a foundation that would be interested and present the project in that manner to that particular foundation. And again, as I noted earlier, foundations don't want to be oftentimes the sole source of the funding for your project, but they can be very ideal for add-on funding and can help get funds to finish the project that you maybe already started, or maybe to get you started right at the very beginning with your project. Maybe you have a pilot community program that you're looking to implement. You know, it's a really good idea, or it seems like a very good idea, and maybe you just want to see how feasible it is. And so maybe starting it on a smaller scale and showing the particular foundation that, you know, this is one discrete step in a longer series of steps might be the way to go. So those are some reasons to perhaps consider foundations as your source of funding that you would apply to. So now focusing on the letter of inquiry and going into some of the particular components of it, what is it? And essentially it's a short version of your full proposal. So it contains everything that's important about your proposal. Again, it's oftentimes just a very short 1 to 2 page document that would contain all of the elements of a full proposal if you could submit a full proposal. And so it has elements like an introduction, an introductory paragraph, a statement of need, a description of your organization and its activities, followed by the problem you're defining, the need that you're looking to fill, and what you're proposing to do to fill that need, and the budget or the funds you need to actually carry out that plan. Go on to the next slide to give you an idea of what this looks like. This is just kind of a template for an LOI, but you can see some of these main elements pointed out. Hopefully it's the text is somewhat legible, but when you do get the slide, just you'll be able to see it better. But I think the sample templates, it's a good idea for it's useful for giving an overall idea of what the letter should include. As you read through it, I will say it lacks a little bit of originality and salesmanship, but it's only really meant to be a start for your idea. Just to get your thinking going about how you could structure this letter of inquiry. But you do see it includes all of the essential elements, the key sections and information that you would want to include in this short 1 to 2 page LOI document. Amongst all these placeholders, you can see that there is inclusion of a specific, or there would be inclusion of a specific dollar request, along with listing the results that that would follow if you were able to carry out this project. Also, another notable thing to note is that this template mentions that this organization already has funding from various other sources and would list them specifically. And I think, again, that can be very powerful just to show, this particular foundation that you're applying to at this moment in time. We've already got all these other players on board. We've already got these interested parties. So I think that can be very powerful to show you've already got all kinds of great support, people behind you who find this project to be promising, potentially very feasible to implement and to deliver on the results that are being proposed. So I think this is very useful to note. The other thing I might note about this is, depending on what space you're allotted, whether it's a 1 page amount of space, 2 pages, maybe a half a page, maybe 1,000 words, whatever it might be, if you're giving yourself that initial time to craft this LOI, this initial document, maybe don't necessarily start with limiting yourself to that limit. Maybe it's perhaps more useful or more practical to just get all of your ideas, all of your details out on that paper and not really worry for the time being if it comes out to be 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 pages, but just kind of getting some comfort knowing that you've put everything down that you want to put down for the moment. And then that's a really good starting point to start cutting from that point on through, however many drafts it takes to get down to the maximum amount of space that's allotted, whether that's, a page or 2. So don't necessarily just, kind of cheat yourself with only concentrating on fitting that 1 to 2 page limit at the outset, and potentially leaving out some details that really you might ultimately find are really powerful to include. So here you can see this kind of introductory paragraph, maybe this first introductory section of your LOI as a potential outline you can follow about all the standard kinds of information that you would include. But I think a couple of important things to note is that while you are pitching your idea, who you are, who your organization is, what you're proposing to do, kind of going back to what Kathy and Lou said in their presentations, is tying back this proposal, what you're proposing to do, to that particular sponsor, that particular foundation and their mission. Because again, if they're not seeing how what you're proposing to do specifically aligns with them, you know, what's in it for them, again, you might have the best idea in the world, but if they're not, you know, seeing how it's directly relevant to them and their mission, it might risk not getting funded. So do focus on your idea, but also show at the same time how you want to develop a partnership with the foundation to help them do what they do even better. So oftentimes a very good strategy for doing this is to include some kind of hooked statement or interesting or exciting or innovative idea that grabs those foundation reviewers' attention right from the start. So in this initial introduction, you might make your as early as you can your specific request. And so over these next few slides, you know, I've included some examples of some funded proposals with their specific requests. You can actually access these examples at the website listed below. But you can see, you know, just from some of this underlined text, how, you know, they don't waste any time. They get right into it with, you know, saying what they want. They want a new education. They want to add a new education segment to their program called SWAT, with, you know, talking about, you know, who they, you know, what they want to do with it, but then they kind of pivot towards the middle of this paragraph with a description of what SWAT is, who it benefits. But then you can see towards the last third or so, in that last bit of underlined text, they kind of pivot back to the request with maybe some more detailed information about what they would do with those resources. So, you know, they start talking about they could increase the frequency of their depression screening and education programs, and how they could conduct these depression education programs. And so hopefully, you know, that's a useful, you know, just from that paragraph, a useful tool just to pique the reviewer's interest, to see that they're, you know, interested and want to read more. You know, that's kind of your end goal. You want this to be very, sometimes grants might not be the most exciting, grant applications might not be the most exciting documents to write, but I think you can make them interesting and generate reviewer interest. That's really your ultimate goal. If you lose them within that first paragraph, sometimes that might not bode well for success. So that's one good example. So here with this, the second example, you can see how, again, kind of a similar structure with this, organization, Lifelong Medical Care. In fact, they launch into their request with a specific dollar amount. So even more detail in how much they need to conduct this external evaluation of one of their particular programs. Then similar to the last example, you see they kind of pivot back to some brief details about their organization, who they serve, what the benefits or the outcomes are of their organization and the work that they do. But again, towards the last third of this paragraph, you see that they pivot back to the requests that they're making. And you know, they get into the very specific types of data, the formative data and the summative data that they want to collect to improve the program and determine which aspects of their program are having the greatest impact. And I think if you read through the rest of this proposal, you would see, they get into much more of the details with this request and who they're looking to impact. But again, just from this outset, this introductory paragraph where they're making their specific request, I think it's a very powerful case where you can see, what they're proposing, what they want to do with that money, and who it would benefit and what the outcomes would be. So finally, on this third example, this is even more concise, as you can tell from the bigger text. But you see, again, they start with a very specific request in terms of the dollar amount that they want. And then within just the second half of that sentence, they say, both what they want to do with it, but you can also get an idea of what their organization is and who they serve, what particular population they serve in serving these, in providing these meals and these snacks. And then in the second sentence, you see they, again, kind of go into some very specific details. I think this really shows how much planning they've done in terms of the breakdown of how many meals they would provide. You can see it's over a year's time, and how many clients they could serve. So I think this is very powerful. You can see just within 2 sentences at the outset how much detail you can present, and with that detail, again, hopefully generate reviewer interest. So let's go back just a little bit to this kind of when you're crafting this introductory paragraph or section about the hook statement. Again, this can be a very powerful tool in terms of generating reviewer interest, where again, you want to pique their interest at the outset. So you want to keep in mind that, again, reviewers are looking through dozens of these applications. So oftentimes they're very tired. Maybe they're kind of looking for any reason not to be, to kind of throw out your application, or maybe not be as interested in your application. So again, you really want to do everything you can to grab their interest at the outset. And so by providing some type of hook statement, you can do that. And so what could the hook statement be? It could be many things. It could be a significant timely event, a recent, maybe a recent grant that you already got and what you've delivered on that grant. Another type of award or accolade that you've gotten for, maybe particularly notable results that you've achieved. You could be maybe focusing on a particular population, emphasizing that population, or even recent work that you've done to help that population, to benefit that population in a particular way. You might maybe even highlight particular successes if you've worked with this foundation before and you're applying to them again, or a similar foundation, just to show that you can deliver on what you propose, and that you deliver results. It could be some particular alarming statistic, something that they wouldn't necessarily know. But again, you want to kind of, whatever you pick for this hook statement, you want to be kind of memorable to the reviewers. You want them to remember you, and kind of in the back of their mind, they'll be like, okay, I remember this application. This was that really timely event or significant statistic that they cited at the beginning. I want to read more about that. So just as one example, you can see with this organization, Fight Asthma Milwaukee, I think this is very effective. In this case, they use a statistic in talking about having extremely high asthma hospitalization rates, in fact, the highest in the state. I think this is really effective for grabbing reviewers' attention and hopefully remembering them, remembering this organization, Fight Asthma Milwaukee, and hopefully the reviewers want to read further. And in this case, clearly they found it to be compelling and wanted to fund this project. So after having this hook statement, this logically flows nicely into the next section of your LOI, the statement of need, which maybe already kind of came through in your introductory paragraph or section, but here you can expand on it some more with a description of the population that you're looking to target, the geographical area, maybe providing more statistical data, or several concrete examples. But again, it ties back to that particular foundation mission, targets their particular niche area. And then after stating that statement of need, this is where really the meat of the proposal is given, where you're going into a fair amount of detail, even in the LOI, with the project activities that you're looking to do and how you're going to carry them out. So again, it should be the longest section, perhaps even provide a smaller brief budget and timeline, including other sources of funding if applicable. But again, hopefully in this, even within all of these details, you're emphasizing the most exciting aspects of the project or the program and generating that reviewer interest. And again, kind of what Kathy was mentioning earlier, this can also be where you describe in some detail your expertise, the team's expertise, and what the individual roles might be on the project. And maybe even perhaps some past relevant successes. And then finally, you might wrap up your LOI with kind of a wrap-up paragraph where maybe you re-emphasize what the impacts would be, what the implications would be if given this funding, what results you would achieve, and maybe what some future ideas might be that stem from a successful result on this proposal. You might, again, just emphasize your willingness to answer any further questions, thank the reviewers for their consideration, provide your contact information if they want to reach out to you in the future. And just note that oftentimes what's nice, again, with these LOIs, by being short documents, is you might get a quicker response than you would with federal agencies, which might be 4, 5, 6, or even more months than that. Whereas maybe with a foundation, particularly a well-staffed foundation, you might get a response with a shorter document like this within a month or two. Not all the time, but it can happen. So with that, I think just made it in time. I'll close my screen and turn it back to Lisa, or we can also answer questions.
Thanks so much, Eric and Kathy. This was great information. Before I start giving out the CME credit instructions, there was a comment for the group here. Can you submit to multiple funders at the same time, same project, or is this frowned upon? Oh, Kathy, you're muted.
In general, it is legitimate to submit the same project to multiple funders with the understanding that if you were to be offered the award by both of them, you could not accept if it was for the same work. So you can't double dip. So, however, there are a couple of organizations that do frown on. NSF is one. And so with the National Science Foundation, that's the biggie. They really don't like to see it going in other places, but you will have to reveal if you have. But in general, what people are doing to maximize their chances of funding is they are taking a proposal, developing it for one sponsor, and then they are submitting it, and then they're going 2 months later to another sponsor, and maybe 2 of the objectives fit. They're repackaging it to that sponsor's priorities. If they were to be awarded somewhere there's some overlap, then in the award process negotiations, you would be ironing out which one is going to sponsor which part of it. So it's just maximizing your potential to get the award, but understanding that you cannot accept it if it's double dipping.
Another question is, page limits are a killer. Do you get points off for adding attachments to a document?
So in general, if they tell you this certain content has to fit in this one page, you have to keep it within that one page. So some sponsors are stricter about this than others, but if, for example, if you have a facilities document where you talk about your environment, some people are tempted to elaborate in the facilities. And if it is straying into content that was specified for the main proposal narrative, you could be in trouble. So you want to be really cautious about that. But yes, the key point, page limits are a killer. That's so true.
One quick question here. Can we blend foundation and federal? A lot of federals seem to want you to use other funding to show commitment.
So say that one again.
It says, can we blend foundation and federal sources? A lot of federals seem to want you to use other funding to show commitment.
Yes, so, and they will usually specify that. They will usually say matching required, matching recommended, and we want it from non-federal sources. And this is where you have to be a little bit careful if you're using a state grant. If the state monies came from a federal source and you're getting it as pass-through, then that could not be it. But in general, yes, if you have some pot of money from some, let's say it's a local foundation, that if you get this grant, they are going to match and provide whatever costs, that's very viable.
Okay, great. We'll have to end it there. It's great questions and such a
Yes.
great session. So thank you very much. So up here in the chat box, I have links for you to get your CE credit. You do visit this first site here to get on the